Audio assessment told us later that the feature had an excellent reception figure. Coming so soon after the American announcement, we hit the peak of popular interest. Their lordships were pleased too. It gave them the opportunity of showing that they did not always have to follow the American lead, though I still think there was no need to make the US a present of the first publicity. Anyway, in view of what has followed, I don't suppose it greatly matters. In the circumstances, Phyllis rewrote a part of the script, making greater play with the fusing of the cables than before. A flood of correspondence came in, but when all the tentative explanations and suggestions had been winnowed, none of us was any wiser than before. Perhaps it was scarcely to be expected that we should be. Our listeners had not even seen the maps, and at this stage it had not occurred to the general public that there could be any link between the diving catastrophes and the somewhat démodé topic of fireballs. But if, as it seemed, the Royal Navy was disposed simply to sit still for a time and ponder the problem theoretically, the US Navy was not. Deviously, we heard that they were preparing to send a second expedition to the same spot where their loss had occurred. We promptly applied to be included and were refused. How many other people applied, I don't know, but enough for them to allocate a second small craft. We couldn't get a place on that either. All space was reserved for their own correspondents and commentators who would cover for Europe too. Well, it was their own show. They were paying for it. All the same, I'm sorry we missed it, because though we did think it was likely they would lose their apparatus again, it never crossed our minds that they might lose their ship as well. About a week after it happened, one of the NBC men who had been covering it came over. We more or less shanghaied him for lunch and the personal dope. "Never saw anything like it, never want to," he said. "They were using an automatic instrument pretty much like the one you people lost. The idea was to send that down first, and if it came up again, okay. Then they'd take another smack at it with a manned depth chamber. What's more, they had a couple of volunteers for it too. Funny the way you can always find a few guys who seemed kind of bored with life on Earth. Anyway, that was the project. We lay off a couple of 100 yards or more from the research ship, but we had a cable slung between us to relay the television so we could watch it on our screens just as well as they could on theirs. We did, a while, but I guess it's one of those subjects you have to have majored in to keep the interest up. The way we saw it, it was more of a test-out. We were aiming to get our real stuff from the depth chamber dive, where there'd be the human angle, even though it had not go down so far. We watched the thing slung overside, and then we went into our saloon to look at the screens. I guess what we saw'd likely be what you saw. Sometimes it was foggy, sometimes clear. Sometimes there'd be quite a few screwy-looking fish and squids and whole flocks of things that don't have any names I ever heard of, and I'd say don't need 'em either. Over the screens was a lighted panel recording the depth, which was a good idea on account of it all looked like it might be going around in an endless band anyway. By 1 mile down, all the guys with the better trained consciences had taken them up on deck under the awning, with smokes and cold drinks. By 2 miles down, I was out there with them, leaving 2 or 3 puritanical characters to cover it and tell us if anything new showed up. After a bit more, one of them quit too and joined me. 2.5 miles, and the last half-mile as dark as the Tunnel of Love. And that wouldn't interest even a fish a lot, from what they tell me, he said. He drew himself a Coke and started to move over towards me. Then he stopped short. "Christ," he said, and simultaneously there was some kind of yell from inside the saloon. I turned my head and looked the way he was looking at the research ship. A moment before, she had been lying there, placid, without a visible movement aboard her, and only the sound of the winch coming over the water to tell you she wasn't derelict, and now she was... Well, I don't know what kind of thunderstorms you folks have over here, but in some places they have a kind where the lightning looks like it's running around all over a building, and that was the way the research ship looked just then. You could hear it crackle, too. She can't have looked that way for more than a few seconds, though it seemed a lot longer. Then she blew up. I don't know what they had aboard her, but she sure did blow. Every one of us hit the deck in a split second, and then there was spray and scrap coming down all over. When we looked again, there wasn't anything there but a lot of water just getting itself smoothed out. We didn't have a lot to pick up. A few bits of wood, half a dozen life buoys, 3 bodies, all badly burnt. We collected what there was and came home. During the longish pause, Phyllis poured him another cup of coffee. "What was it?" she asked. He shrugged. "It could have been coincidence, but say we rule that out, then I'd guess that if ever lightning were to strike upwards from the sea, that'd be about the way it'd look." "I never heard of anything like that," Phyllis said. "It certainly isn't on the record," he agreed, "but there has to be a first time." "Not very satisfactory," Phyllis commented. He looked us over. "Seeing that you two were on that British fishing party, do I take it you know why we were there?" "I'd not be surprised," I told him. He nodded. "Well, look," he said, "I'm told it isn't possible to persuade a high charge, say a few million volts, to run up an uninsulated hawser in seawater, so I must accept that. It's not my department. All I say is that if it were possible, then I guess the effect might be quite a bit like what we saw." "There'd be insulated cables, too, to the cameras, microphones, thermometers and things," Phyllis said. "Sure, and there was an insulated cable relaying the TV to our ship, but it couldn't carry that charge and burned out, which was a darn good thing for us. That would make it look to me like it followed the main hawser. If it didn't so happen that the physics boys won't have it." "They've no alternative suggestions?" I asked. "Oh, sure, several. Some of them could sound quite convincing to a fellow who'd not seen it happen." "If you are right, this is very queer indeed," Phyllis said reflectively. The NBC man looked at her. "A nice British backhand understatement. But it's queer enough, even without me," he said modestly. "However they explain this away, the physics boys are still stumped on those fused cables because, whatever this may be, those cable severances couldn't have been accidental." "On the other hand, all that way down, all that pressure," Phyllis said. He shook his head. "I'm making no guesses. I'd want more data than we've got, even for that. Could be we'll get it before long." We looked questioning. He lowered his voice. "Seeing you're in this too, but strictly under your hats. They've got a couple more probes lined up right now, but no publicity this time. The last lot had a nasty taste." "Where?" we asked simultaneously. "One off the Aleutians someplace, the other in a deep spot in the Guatemala basin. What are your folks doing?" "We don't know," we said honestly. He shook his head. "Always kind of close, you people," he said sympathetically. And close they remained. During the next few weeks we kept our ears uselessly wide open for news of either of the 2 new investigations, but it was not until the NBC man was passing through London again a month later that we learnt anything. We asked him what had happened. He frowned. "Off Guatemala they drew blank," he said. "The ship south of the Aleutians was transmitting by radio while the dive was in progress. It cut out suddenly. She's reported as lost with all hands." Official cognizance of these matters remained underground, if that can be considered an acceptable term for their deep-sea investigations. Every now and then we would catch a rumour which showed that the interest had not been dropped, and from time to time a few apparently isolated items could, when put in conjunction, be made to give hints. Our naval contacts preserved an amiable evasiveness, and we found that our opposite numbers across the Atlantic were doing little better with their naval sources. The consoling aspect was that had they been making any progress, we should most likely have heard of it, so we took silence to mean that they were stalled. Public interest in fireballs was now down to 0, and few people troubled to send in reports of them any more. I still kept my files going, though they were now so unrepresentative that I could not tell how far the apparently low incidence was real. As far as I knew, the 2 phenomena had never so far been publicly connected, and presently both were allowed to lapse unexplained like any silly season sensation. In the course of the next 3 years, we ourselves lost interest almost to vanishing point. Other matters occupied us. There was the birth of our son, William, and his death 18 months later. To help Phyllis get over that, I wangled myself a travelling correspondence series, sold up the house, and for a time we roved. In theory, the appointment was simply mine. In practice, most of the gloss and finish on the scripts which pleased the EBC were Phyllis's, and most of the time when she wasn't dolling up my stuff, she was working on scripts of her own. When we came back home, it was with enhanced prestige, a lot of material to work up, and a feeling of being set on a smooth, steady course. Almost immediately, the Americans lost a cruiser off the Marianas. The report was scanty, an agency message slightly blown up locally, but there was something about it, just a kind of feeling. When Phyllis read it in the newspaper, it struck her, too. She pulled out the atlas and considered the Marianas. "It's pretty deep around 3 sides of them," she said. "That report's not handled quite the regular way. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but the approach is a bit off the line somehow," I agreed. "We'd better try the grapevine," Phyllis decided. We did, without result. It wasn't that our sources were holding out on us. There seemed to be a blackout somewhere. We got no further than the official handout. This cruiser, the Keweenaw, had, in fair weather, simply gone down. 20 survivors had been picked up. There would be an official inquiry. Possibly there was. I never heard the outcome. The incident was somehow overlaid by the inexplicable sinking of a Russian ship engaged on some task never specified to eastward of the Kurils, that string of islands to the south of Kamchatka. Since it was axiomatic that any Soviet misadventure must be attributable in some way to capitalist jackals or reactionary fascist hyenas, this affair assumed an importance which quite eclipsed the more serious American loss, and the acrimonious innuendos went on echoing for some time. In the noise of vituperation, the mysterious disappearance of the survey vessel Utskarpen in the Southern Ocean went almost unnoticed outside her native Norway. Several others followed, but I no longer have my records to give me the details. It is my impression that quite half a dozen vessels, all seemingly engaged in ocean research in one way or another, had vanished before the Americans suffered again off the Philippines. This time they lost a destroyer, and with it their patience. The ingenious announcement that since the water about Bikini was too shallow for a contemplated series of deep-water atomic bomb tests, the locale of these experiments would be shifted westwards by a little matter of 1,000 miles or so may possibly have deceived a portion of the general public, but in radio and newspaper circles it touched off a scramble for assignments. Phyllis and I had better standing now, and we were lucky too. We flew out there, and a few days later we formed part of the complement of a number of ships lying at a strategic distance from the point where the Keweenaw had gone down off the Marianas. I can't tell you what that specially designed depth bomb looked like, for we never saw it. All we were allowed to see was a raft supporting a kind of semi-spherical metal hut which contained the bomb itself, and all we were told was that it was much like one of the more regular types of atomic bomb, but with a massive casing that would resist the pressure at 5 miles deep, if necessary. At first light on the day of the test, a tug took the raft in tow and chugged away over the horizon with it. From then on we had to observe by means of unmanned television cameras mounted on floats. In this way we saw the tug cast off the raft and put off at full speed. Then there was an interval while the tug hurried out of harm's way and the raft pursued a calculated drift towards the exact spot where the Keweenaw had disappeared. The hiatus lasted for some 3 hours, with the raft looking motionless on the screens. Then a voice through the loudspeakers told us that the release would take place in approximately 30 minutes. It continued to remind us at intervals until the time was short enough for it to start counting in reverse, slowly and calmly. There was a complete hush as we stared at the screens and listened to the voice. 3, 2, 1, now. On the last word, a rocket sprang from the raft, trailing red smoke as it climbed. "Bomb away," said the voice. We waited. For a long time, as it seemed, everything was intensely still. Around the vision screens no one spoke. Every eye was on one or another of the frames which showed the raft calmly afloat on the blue, sunlit water. There was no sign that anything had occurred there, save the plume of red smoke drifting slowly away. For the eye and the ear there was utter serenity. For the feelings, a sense that the whole world held its breath. Then it came. The placid surface of the sea suddenly belched into a vast white cloud which spread and boiled, writhing upwards. A tremor passed through the ship. We left the screens and rushed to the ship's side. Already the cloud was above our horizon. It writhed and convolved upon itself in a fashion that was somehow obscene as it climbed monstrously up the sky. Only then did the sound reach us in a buffeting roar. Much later, amazingly delayed, we saw the dark line which was the first wave of turbulent water rushing towards us. That night we shared a dinner table with Malaby of the Tidings and Bennell of the Senate. I claim no credit for being included in such illustrious company, except in so far as I had had the good sense to marry Phyllis, and got her used to having me around before she perceived how widely she could have chosen. This was her show. We have a technique for that. I come off the sidelines just enough to show sociable, but not enough to interfere with her plan of campaign. The rest of the time I watch and admire. It is something like a combination of skilled juggling with expert chess, and her recoveries from an unexpected move are a delight to follow. She seldom loses. This time she had them more or less where she wanted them, between the entree and the joint. It's been the reluctance to postulate an intelligence that's been the chief stumbling block, Malaby remarked. But here at last we have a half admission. I'd still question intelligence, Bennell replied. The line between instinctive action and intelligent action, particularly as regards self-defence, can be very uncertain, if only because both may often produce the same response. But you can't deny that whatever is the cause of it, it is an entirely new factor, Malaby said. At this point I saw Phyllis relax from her efforts to get them going and settle down to listen. Bennell told him, I could say that the factor may have been down there for centuries, but that it remained uninterested in us so long as we did not disturb it by probing into its environment. You could, agreed Malaby. But if I were you, I wouldn't. Beebe and Barton went down deep and nothing happened to them. You're disregarding the fused cables, too. There's certainly nothing instinctive there. Bennell grinned. They're awkward, I admit, but any theory I've heard so far has half a dozen factors quite as troublesome. And the electrification of that American ship? Just static, I suppose? Well, do we know enough of the conditions to be sure that it wasn't? Malaby snorted. For heaven's sake! Lulling is for babes and nitwits. But if the choice lies between that and accepting the Bocker line, I'm inclined to prefer it. I'm no Bocker champion. I doubt whether the thing as presented by him sounds more ludicrous to you than it does to me, but look what we're facing. A lot of explanations that will neither wash singly nor hang together, or Bocker's line. And however we feel about it, he does tie in more factors than anyone else. So, without a doubt, would Jules Verne, observed Bennell. The introduction of this Bocker element set me all at sea, and Phyllis, too, though it would have been hard to guess it from the way she said, Surely the Bocker line can't be altogether dismissed, frowning a little as she spoke. It worked. In a little time we were adequately briefed on the Bocker view, and without either of them guessing that as far as we were concerned, he'd come into it for the first time. The name of Alistair Bocker was not, of course, entirely unknown to us. It was that of an eminent geographer, customarily followed by several groups of initials. However, the information on him that Phyllis now prompted forth was something quite new to us. When reordered and assembled, it amounted to this. Almost a year earlier, Bocker had presented a memorandum to the Admiralty in London. Because he was Bocker, it succeeded in getting itself read at some quite important levels, although the gist of its argument was as follows. The fused cables and electrification of certain ships must be regarded as indisputable evidence of intelligence at work in certain deeper parts of the oceans. Conditions such as pressure, temperature, perpetual darkness, etc. in those regions made it inconceivable that any intelligent form of life could have evolved there, and this statement he backed with several convincing arguments. It was to be assumed that no nation was capable of constructing mechanisms that could operate at such depths as indicated by the evidence, nor would they have any purpose in attempting to do so. But if the intelligence in the depths were not indigenous, then it must have come from elsewhere. Also, it must be embodied in some form able to withstand a pressure of 2 tons per square inch, or possibly twice as much. Now, where else on Earth could a form find conditions of such pressure wherein to evolve? Clearly, nowhere. Very well then. If it could not have evolved on Earth, it must have evolved somewhere else, say on a large planet where the pressures were normally very high. If so, how did it cross space and arrive here? Bocker then recalled attention to the fireballs, which had aroused so much speculation a few years ago and were still occasionally to be seen. None of these had been known to descend on land. None, indeed, had been known to descend anywhere but in areas of very deep water. Moreover, such of them as had been struck by missiles had exploded with such violence as to suggest that they had been retaining a very high degree of pressure. It was significant also that these fireball globes invariably sought the only regions of the Earth in which high-pressure conditions compatible with movement were available. Therefore, Bocker deduced, we were in the process, while almost unaware of it, of undergoing a species of interplanetary invasion. If he were to be asked the source of it, he would point to Jupiter as being most likely to fulfill the conditions of pressure. His memorandum had concluded with the observation that such an incursion need not necessarily be regarded as hostile. There was such a thing as flight to refuge from conditions that had become intolerable. It seemed to him that the interests of a type of creation which existed at 15 pounds to the square inch were unlikely to overlap seriously with those of a form which required several tons per square inch. He advocated, therefore, that the greatest efforts should be made to develop some means of making a sympathetic approach to the new dwellers in our depths, with the aim of facilitating an exchange of science, using the word in its widest sense. The views expressed by their lordships upon these elucidations and suggestions are not publicly recorded. It is known, however, that no long interval passed before Bocker withdrew his memorandum from their unsympathetic desks and shortly afterwards presented it for the personal consideration of the editor of the Tidings. Undoubtedly the Tidings, in returning it to him, expressed itself with its usual tact. It was only for the benefit of his professional brethren that the editor remarked, "This newspaper has managed to exist for more than 100 years without a comic strip, and I see no reason to break that tradition now." In due course, the memorandum appeared in front of the editor of the Senate, who glanced at it, called for a synopsis, lifted his eyebrows, and dictated an urbane regret. Subsequently, it occurred upon 2 other editorial desks of the more cloistered kind, but after that it ceased to circulate and was known only by word of mouth within a small circle. "What I have never understood about it," Phyllis said, with a slight frown and an air of having been familiar with the situation for years, "is why something like the Daily Tape or the Lens hasn't run it. Isn't it just their stuff? Or what about the American tabloids?" "The Tape very nearly did," Mallaby told her. "Only Bocker said he'd sue them if they mentioned his name. He's after respectable publication or none at all. So the Tape tried to get some other well-known figure to sponsor the idea as if it were his own. Nobody was keen. Bocker got his stuff printed, deposited it, and claimed copyright, so that was off. They dropped it because without some weighty kind of backing it would be just another Tape scare, and the circulation figures hadn't justified their last 2 scares. The Lens and the others are in roughly the same jam. One small American paper did use a chewed-up version, but as it was their 3rd interplanetary danger in 4 months, it didn't register well. The others thought it over and reckoned that it would be too easy to be accused of making cheap capital out of the loss of the lives in the Keweenaw, so they threw it out. But it will come. Before long, one or another of them is bound to splash it, with or without Bocker's name and consent, and almost certainly without his main point, which was to try to make some kind of contact. They'll stress just what Benel here stressed just now, the comic, horrific strip aspect. Make your flesh creep stuff. "And what other use can you make of a farrago like that?" Benel inquired. "Well, you can at least say, as I said before, that he does include more factors than anyone else has, and that anything that includes even most of the factors is, ipso facto, bound to be fantastic. We may decry it, but for all that, until something better turns up, it's the best we have." Benel shook his head. "You begged the whole thing at the start. Suppose I concede for the moment that there does seem to be intelligence of some kind down there. You've no solid proof that intelligence couldn't evolve at a few tons to the square inch as easily as at 15 pounds? You've nothing to support you but sheer common sense. The same kind of common sense that was satisfied that heavier-than aircraft could never fly. Prove to me you've got it wrong. He claims that the intelligence must have evolved under high pressure, but that it couldn't do so under the other conditions obtaining in our deeps. But whatever you concede, and whatever the top naval men may think about Bocker, it is clear enough that they must have been assuming for some time that there is something intelligent down there. You don't design and make a special bomb like that all in 5 minutes, you know. Anyway, whether the Bocker theory is sheer hot air or not, he's lost his main point. This bomb was not the amiable and sympathetic approach that he advocated." Malaby paused and shook his head. "I've met Bocker several times. He's a civilized, liberal-minded man, with the usual trouble of liberal-minded men, that they think others are too. He has an interested, inquiring mind. He has never grasped that the average mind, when it encounters something new, is scared and says, better smash it or suppress it, quick. Well, he's just had another demonstration of the average mind at work. But, Benel objected, if, as you say, it is officially believed that these ship losses have been caused by an intelligence, then there's something to be scared about. And you can't put today's affair down as anything stronger than retaliation." Malaby shook his head again. "My dear Benel, I not only can, but I do. Suppose now that something were to come dangling down to us on a rope out of space, and suppose that that thing was emitting rays on a wavelength that acutely discomforted us, perhaps even caused us physical pain. What should we do? I suggest that the first thing we should do would be to snip the rope and put it out of action. Then we should examine the strange object and find out what we could about it. Then suppose that more strange objects began to be reported dangling down from above and causing discomfort to our citizens. We should argue, this looks like a kind of invasion, or reconnaissance for one. Anyway, it is extremely painful to us, so whatever it is up there doing it has got to be stopped. And we should forthwith take what steps we could to discourage it. It might be done simply in the spirit of ending a nuisance, or it might be done with some animosity and regarded as retaliation. Now, would it be we or the thing above that was to blame? In the present case, and after today's performance, the question becomes simply academic. It is difficult to imagine any kind of intelligence that would not resent what we've just done. If this were the only deep where the trouble has occurred, there might well be no intelligence left to resent it. But this isn't the only place, as you know, not by any means. So what form that very natural resentment will take remains for us to see. "You think there really will be some kind of response, then?" Phyllis asked. He shrugged. "To take up my analogy again, suppose that some violently destructive agency were to descend from space upon one of our cities. What should we do?" "Well, what could we do?" asked Phyllis, reasonably enough. "We could turn the backroom boys onto it, and if it happened a few times more, we should soon be giving the backroom boys full priorities." "You're assuming a lot, Malaby," Benel put in. "For one thing, an almost parallel state of development. The significance of the word priority even has a semantic dependence on conditions. It could scarcely mean a thing a century ago, and in the 18th century you could have howled priority until you were blue in the face without creating any technical advance whatever, because our modern idea of research wasn't there. Nobody would even understand what you were after." "True," agreed Malaby. But after what happened to those ships, I'm justified in assuming quite a degree of technology there, I think. Phyllis said, "Is it really too late for some such approach as Bocker wanted? I mean, there's only been one bomb. If there isn't another, they might think it was a natural disaster, an eruption or something." Mallaby shook his head. "It won't be just one bomb, and it was always too late, my dear. Can you imagine us tolerating any form of rival intelligence on Earth, no matter how it got here? Why, we can't even tolerate anything but the narrowest differences of views within our own race. No," he shook his head, "no, I'm afraid Bocker's idea of fraternization never had the chance of a flea in a furnace."
The Kraken Wakes was written by John Wyndham and read by Stephen Moore, and the programme was produced in Belfast by Susan Carson.